Hello everyone. Thank you for being here today. Today I am going to talk about domestic violence and abuse, which is a significant public health issue affecting millions of individuals and communities across the world. I am going to talk about the project as well, which we did for the Festival of Mind, and the project was titled Phoenix, and through this project we wanted to raise awareness of domestic violence and abuse and its impact. So, what I am going to do today in this talk in next few minutes is talk about domestic violence, talk about prevalence of domestic violence, impact of it, and why is it important to raise awareness and how can we prevent it. I will also tell you a little bit about the project and what we did and give you some glimpse of the installation of the photos that we through which you could see the project, what it looks like. So, violence as defined by World Health Organization is the international use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment or deprivation. So, this is a general definition of violence, and when it comes to domestic violence, it is an umbrella term which talks about various violence acts which happen within the context of domestic, within the context of family, and it can also include quite a lot of different forms of abuse, including child abuse, elder abuse, as well as intimate partner violence. However, intimate partner violence makes the biggest, it's the most common form of abuse which comes under the category in the domestic violence and abuse. So, what is intimate partner violence? Well, it refers to a pattern of abusive behavior in the context of intimate relationship. And as I said earlier, it's the most common form of abuse within the context of domestic violence and abuse. It can happen it can take various different forms. It can happen as a result of in the context of physical abuse, which means hitting somebody or being physically abusive towards them. It can also the form of sexual abuse or psychological abuse, and it can take the examples of various acts which come under domestic violence could be shouting, name calling, hitting, beating, forced sex, and controlling somebody else's life. Forced marriages, honor-based violence, and female genital mutilation are also identified as examples of domestic abuse, especially in the UK, and as examples of gender-based violence all across the world. When it comes to prevalence of domestic abuse, we do not really know the actual prevalence because of underreporting of the issue and because of the various definitions used in different places. However, studies conducted worldwide suggest the prevalence 1 in 3 women are affected by domestic violence, and it ranges between 23.2% in high income countries to 37.7% in Southeast region and 36.6% in African region of World Health Organization. And this picture here tells you the glimpse of the issue in the context of United Kingdom, and you can see the prevalence with regards to any form of domestic abuse, any form of partner violence, and any form of family abuse. And though the rates have stayed kind of pretty much similar throughout that time, it's not decreasing either. So, which suggests that the issue is quite common and affects quite a lot of people wherever they are. I think here it is important to mention that men can also be victims of violence, and it can happen in heterosexual as well as homosexual relationships. It can be perpetrated by women. However, women remains to be the main victims of abuse. The intensity and severity of abuse which is experienced by women is often much more higher than any other gender, or like for example than men, or in any other relationship. So therefore, it's often identified as a gender-based issue and something where women are affected mostly. It is also important to note that for women most of the time the perpetrators is often somebody they know, and especially intimate partner, who could be a current intimate partner or a former one. Whereas for men, though they do experience abuse, but it's usually is from stranger. And when it comes to domestic abuse, here are some statistics which you can see that 1 in 6 women do experience domestic violence in their life, and every third victims of domestic abuse is a man, and it equates approximately to 25% of all reported violent crimes, and 9% of all reported violent crimes are domestic violence cases involving male victims. And if you look at it, it's nearly 4 million men are affected every year by domestic abuse. However, men who report abuse by partner or ex-partner are less likely to report being frightened or being upset by what has happened to them, or they're less likely to be exposed to repeated pattern of abuse, which is very true when it comes to women. So this figure again tells you a little bit about the prevalence of domestic abuse, and it basically tells you what I've just said, that women remains to be the main victim in regardless of which relationship they live in. So you've got examples of married women, women who are widowed, women who are cohabiting, single, divorced, and separated women. And you could see that especially separation and divorce are those places where women, the rate of abuse gets much more higher. So you see more number of women being exposed to abuse at that time. So abusive behavior is a part of continuum from what may appear very less serious, something very trivial to homicide, so killing somebody and depriving somebody of their life. Perpetrators' intention are usually to control the person, to punish the person, to intimidate them, or to dominate them. So it is something which is planned. It is something which doesn't happen by accident. Victims lack consent or agreement into it, and perpetrators use their identity, which could be age, which could be class, which could be disability, ethnicity, sexuality, or any of those characteristics of their own or their partner to increase the abuse or to justify the abuse which they have. It can result in physical, psychological trauma, as I've said earlier on. So physical trauma, psychological issues, as well as fear and control. And if we look at it in a little bit more detail in terms of physical trauma, it can result in injuries, ranging from minor injuries to bites, cuts, bruises, to somebody losing their limb or a bigger disability. It affects psychological health of the person experiencing it. They can experience post-traumatic stress disorders, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and various other psychological disorders. It may also impact or increase the substance abuse or misuse behavior among victims as well, because they may use it as a coping mechanism to deal with the issues which they are experiencing. It can also result fear and control, which then has an impact on victims' ability to access services or to access things that they need. So, for example, contraceptive services and access to healthcare services. Because they may not be allowed to access these services on their own, they may not be able to go on their own, they may not have transportation, or depending on where you are in the world, it could be quite different for various people. And so in addition, it can help, it can affect people's ability to access services, and it can also affect sexual and reproductive health of women. We also know that domestic violence and abuse increases during pregnancy, which then means that it not only affects the mother, but it can also have an effect on the unborn child and the unborn baby, and it can affect the birth weight, it can result in a premature delivery, or it can even result in the loss of pregnancy. So these are just kind of examples of the impact of domestic abuse. When it comes to children, being exposed to domestic abuse, which means witnessing abuse or experiencing abuse, could be quite traumatic for children, and it affects their growth and development. It affects their mental health, it affects their concentration into the studies, and it may also have an impact on their ability to integrate with other people, to play with other people, and to develop relationship later on. And these are just a few examples of the effect which it can have on children. There's quite a lot that we still do not know about the impact of exposure to domestic abuse to children. So that's something that we need to explore through further research. So coming back to the project. So the project, as I mentioned earlier on, called Phoenix, and through this project we wanted to raise awareness about domestic violence and abuse, because as I said earlier, it is a prevalent problem in all across the world, in all different regardless of the religion, gender, ethnicity, it affects people and especially women. So we wanted to raise awareness about not only what it is, but also how it has an impact on those experiencing it and others around them. So these are some of the pictures which tells you what it looks like to experience abuse. So you can see somebody being caged in a place, or actually being caged, or feeling like being caged, somebody being controlled by somebody else in terms of their decision and other aspects. And there are some more glimpses here. The exhibition is live in Sheffield, and the address and other details are available on the website. So if you are available and if you live nearby, please do come and visit and let us know what you think. So a little bit about the project. COVID-19 has affected how envisaged the project would run, because the initial idea was that we wanted to engage with organizations and individuals in physical format, in kind of through workshops and discussions, and to be able to develop these figures involving people and giving them the opportunity to develop it. However, because of the COVID-19, that wasn't possible. So we had to shift the way we did the project, and instead of having physical consultations, we opted for the online consultations, online surveys, and speaking to individuals in different forms. We also use social media to get people's views about their feelings, their what is it they would like to share, and how does it make them feel, and how can it be depicted in a form that others can understand those experiences. So I worked with an artist, Angela Hardwick, who specializes in making ceramic installations and wall mounts, highlighting various different issues, and this is the result that you see here. If you wanted to know more about work of Angela or my work, please check the website. So that's just some further glimpse. So why did we want to do it? As I said, we wanted to raise awareness about domestic violence and abuse, so which then makes you think, what is it which we can do to prevent it? Well, it is a preventable problem, and we can do a lot to prevent it through various different activities all across the world, in our homes, in our institutions where we work, in our communities where we live, in our countries where we live, and then throughout the world. So what can we do? So I'm going to talk about Respect Framework, which is endorsed by World Health Organization, and it has got various points in relation to each alphabet of respect and what does it mean. So we can prevent domestic abuse by looking at respect. So R stands for relationship skills strengthening, so which means that we need to help people understand what is relationship, how to develop relationships, how to manage conflicts constructively, how to deal with anger issues constructively, how do you talk to each other, and how to develop relationships basically. E stands for empowerment, which means activities in the household, in the institutions where we work, in the cities and countries where we live, with regards to empowering women to be able to be themselves, to be able to work effectively, and to be able to make decisions and come into the leadership positions, and all various aspects that we can think about. S refers to services ensured. This refers to ensuring that services are provided for all those who need those services, especially victims of domestic abuse and survivors of domestic abuse, looking at their needs and making sure that services are available for them when they need it, and referral services and other aspects are taken care of and they're not left alone. Alleviating poverty in whatever countries we are working on. Again, this relates to household, this relates to cities, this relates to countries, making sure that women are economically independent, making sure that they have got access to their assets, they can own those assets, making sure that they have got access to jobs, and in a nutshell, reducing poverty that is experienced by women. Making the environment safe for women, which includes environment at home, environment in institutions where we work, environment in schools, environment on the streets where we walk, making places harassment free for women, and providing an enabling environment where they can grow and achieve their potential. C refers to child and adolescent abuse prevention. So preventing child abuse and adolescent abuse in whatever setting children and adolescents are, managing and reducing and preventing harassment, reducing other forms of child abuse which happens in any settings that we could think of. T refers to transforming attitudes, beliefs and norms, and I think this is the biggest aspect which we all need to work on. We all need to look at our own attitudes, our own beliefs and our own prejudices about women, about violence. How do we see violence? How do we see violence against women? And how do we see domestic abuse? And what do we think about it? Do we think it is acceptable? Do we think it's, what can we do to prevent it? So I think it is about the attitudes that each one of us has to work on and explore and change it. So, and that then needs to be, so once we have transformed our attitudes and beliefs throughout the world, I think that would be the biggest success and would help a lot in reducing domestic violence and abuse in any setting that we could think of. So just to summarize, we need to increase the understanding of issues involved with regards to domestic violence and abuse. We need to identify support system which could help women seek support initially, which could help women disclose abuse to those providing services earlier on without feeling ashamed, without feeling being responsible for the abuse which they are experiencing, and without feeling the fear of any repercussions to their children or their family. We need to be able to provide information on remedies available and signpost to available services to all those who would like to deal with the issues around domestic violence and abuse. There needs to be proper referral mechanisms to agencies and professionals who can assist with legal and social services when it's needed. And we need to ensure that institutions and agencies are responsive to special needs of women who are experiencing abuse, or anyone who is experiencing abuse, and or anyone who would like to change their behavior as well. We need to develop legislations that address the need of refugees, immigrants and migrant women, because these are some of those groups among women who face additional barriers when it comes to accessing services, when it comes to disclosing their abuse, and when it comes to getting themselves out of those situations. So there needs to be special attention paid to these groups to ensure that they have got similar access as others. So this is from me. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions. So I'm just going to look at the questions which have been posted through the chat. And the first question is, how willing are people to take part in the research, and do you know what proportion of domestic violence is reported? As I said, the proportion of domestic violence reported differs depending on which country do you live in. It differs depending on the measures which has been used to, what is identified as verbal abuse or psychological abuse in one country. People may not see that as the same thing in another country. So that makes it slightly harder to identify the proportion of the actual proportion of abuse which people are experiencing. However, we know that 1 in 3 women experience abuse in their lifetime anywhere in the world. In terms of your next question, which was about are people willing to take part in research? Yes, people are willing to take part in research when it comes to. Sometimes it is difficult to engage depending on which stage of their journey they are. So if they are somebody who are experiencing abuse quite early on and they think it's their fault, and or they're not sure if what they're experiencing is abuse, then that's different. But obviously it is quite a sensitive topic, and it's not always easy to disclose your experiences or to even accept or admit your experiences. So that does deter people from contributing to research. But in my experience, yes, people are willing to contribute, as long as you've taken the right step to ensure their safety and to ensure that they are not harmed in any ways. Question 2, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on domestic violence and abuse? Well, COVID-19 has resulted an increase in domestic violence and abuse in terms of the deaths that has happened as a result of domestic violence or abuse, and in terms of the rate at which people have experienced, because people were locked into their houses. So that means that people who needed support would not be able to access support services. Services were not able to get to those people when it needs be. The environment was stressful anyway because of the economic situation, stress around COVID-19 and other various aspects. So it has increased, and I can just give you one example that there has been 700% increase reported to the calls to the helpline for domestic abuse. So that's just one example from this country, but it has been happening throughout the world. So there has been an increase. How did services change their responses to help women experiencing abuse during lockdown? I think it varied. Depending on which country did you live, depending on what setting did you live within countries, it varied as well, depending on what can you actually do. So for example, where it was possible for people to provide, for example, healthcare professionals, if they provided online consultations, so that was one way that they tried to assess the situation and refer people to other services. But people have used various different techniques to try and kind of help in those situations. Having said that, because the pandemic was something completely new and no one expected it, I think it has been quite difficult. So therefore, people are now working on the strategies or on the interventions which can be used in a similar situation if that happens in ever in future. So pandemics or epidemics like COVID-19 are very common, and it's not that the one which we experience now is going to be the last one. So therefore, we need to know what do we need to do when it comes to the emergency situations like this. So I hope that answers your question. Question 3, what in your view are the most effective practical methods for curbing domestic violence? For example, does therapy of perpetrator work? I think the biggest thing in my personal view is talking and tackling attitudes. Attitudes towards women, attitudes towards violence, attitudes towards domestic abuse. And that would change a lot. We have seen recently, and it's not limited to any one particular country, but women are being made responsible for the abuse which they suffer. So there is a lot of victimization goes on. If, for example, a woman experiences rape or something, so it's usually she's the one who is being accused or asked very, very difficult questions, which suggests that she was the one who was responsible for what has happened to her. So I think that comes back to attitudes, as I said. So I think that is something which needs changing. Your next point about if the therapy for perpetrators work, yes, evidence suggests that therapy for perpetrators work to a certain extent. Various studies which have been conducted on this particular aspect tell us that about 40% of people, 30 to 40% of people do change their behavior. Not everybody changes their behavior, but again, this is something which can work for some people. So if people are really willing to change their behavior, if they understand their behavior is wrong, so then I think domestic violence perpetrator program are an effective way to help them and to support them realize their issues, realize what causes the problems, realize the impact of abuse, and why they should change their behavior, and they do work. Have you come across any evidence for men or women being treated differently when reporting abuse? I think that's not one of my expertise, I would say, but in terms of, we do know that for men, it sometimes is even harder to disclose abuse if they're experiencing, because of, again, attitudes, again, how we see men, how we see them There's this concept about that men are not exposed to abuse, and therefore if you are experiencing abuse, you are not a strong person, you're not a strong man, which then means that people do not often come and report it. So I think that does have a consequence. But once you are accessing services, it depends on who you are working with and what kind of relationship you have. If you've got an open and honest relationship, I think then that helps. But I'm not sure if services deal with men or women any differently depending on their, just because of their gender. It could be different based on, if you have got dependent children with you, and then obviously, and if they are exposed to abuse. So then of course the weights dealt, or the facilities available, or other aspects perhaps would be slightly different, but not because of your gender. However, reporting, understanding of abuse that men experience, and people from LGBTQ community or other from vulnerable groups, as I talked about, people from minority ethnic groups, or women stuck in conflict affected areas, war zones, or people with disabilities, we still do not really understand the need as clearly as we should. So this is something that we really need to keep on working on. Okay, the next question: what do you consider to be the main issues for people in LGBT plus relationship that are abusive, in terms of the abuse being identified, as well as the main barriers to access support services? I think in any type of relationship, be it heterosexual, homosexual, same-sex relationship, or whatever name you use with, for those relationships, or for anyone, if it's men or women, I think disclosing abuse is quite hard. Accepting and telling somebody takes quite a long time. On average for women, it takes about 2 years before they disclose the abuse that they're experiencing to somebody else, because initially you don't believe that's happening. You may think it's your fault. You may think it may change. So I think those barriers remain the same. People providing services, if their attitudes and their prejudice and stereotypes and societies, as a society, how we deal with things, would have an impact on, again, the way we provide services, the way we disclose abuse to services, and therefore, what I'm trying to say is that if there is not enough disclosure to abuse, obviously there would be less services available, because usually the supply and demand principle works wherever. So I think there are issues around those barriers. Again, these barriers could be amplified because one individual, there's not one barrier which affects someone. There could be multiple barriers which are affecting somebody. So it could be language, it could be the ethnicity that you belong to, it could be the sexual orientation, as you've mentioned. So I think all those in combination makes it quite hard for people to access services, and to start off with, to mention their needs. So I think there are quite a lot of those barriers that we need to explore. So I hope this information and this talk was useful for you. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.